About a month ago, I asked a carpenter shop whether they could give me their scrap wood, and they gave me all the wood you can see here for a fair price. But we will see later that the wood is not completely flawless because I planed through a nail. But apart from that, I was very impressed by the quality of the wood. Initially, I had planned just to replace the chessboard I sold. However, when measuring, I realized that I could also build two boards. In fact, the chessboard I sold was not my first chessboard. I've built 5 before. All were made of walnut and maple for the squares, and all but one had a walnut edge. I would say I've always kept the design of the boards very minimalistic. For example, I made sure that there were a few knot holes, cracks or other damage to the wood. Because I had enough wood for 2 boards, I wanted to experiment a little with one of them. The piece I'm planning here has a very beautiful irregular grain that shines from the outside even without oil, and I have a similar piece made of birch wood, where my idea was to combine both of them for the field to create a uniform interesting surface regardless of the color of the squares. This time I decided to use very rough wood for the edge, and the cracks of it I will fill with, I will not use epoxy, I will fill it differently. I don't like working with epoxy because it's nothing more than liquid plastic. On the other hand, my method is not much better, but my method is more stable and not as prone to scratches. We will see later how this turns out. In any case, I am still very unsure at the moment whether I like the contrast between the birch and the walnut as much as the contrast between the maple and the walnut. I also don't have enough birch wood for the board and the figures, so the figures will also be made of maple, but for sure you could also make them out of birch if necessary later. I've already noticed in my last project that there is a surprising amount of tension in the wood. I had to stop the saw several times to release the wood from the riving knife. The tension in the piece was so big that it would certainly have kickback. In that case, the camera wouldn't even have been positioned in such a way that I would have filmed it, so it's better to have a riving knife. Apart from that, you can clearly see here what I meant by the wood is almost glowing by its own. I really didn't want to make a wrong cut because I had so little of the beautiful grain. And at this point I have a question for you. With the smaller pieces I never have the problem of the wood jamming on the riving knife, but almost always with the larger ones. Is this perhaps due to my saw? In my case, the width of the riving knife is between the width of the saw teeth and the width of the saw blade. But could it be that the teeth become narrower over time due to frequent use? I'm just a nerdy math student who has no clue about practical stuff, so if you know what could be causing this, please let me know in the comments. The fact that I have already built 6 chessboards has taught me one thing. If you saw all the squares individually, it doesn't matter how precisely you work, the result always sucks. If one is not 100% perfect, this is not only transferred to the neighboring squares, but to the whole row, column, and then no corner is perfect. The only way to make the chessboard as good as possible is to reduce the possibility of messing up. If you only cut stripes first and glue them together as you can see here, then nothing can go wrong so far. Then we will cut the stripes again at the same distance, perpendicular to the pattern, and glue them staggered together. In this way you have reduced 64 ways to fail to just 8. And if we assume that I would have failed with a probability of 100%, then it would now only be 12.5%. And when I have finished building the 2 boards, I will have built a total of 8. With a failure rate of 12.5%, exactly 1 out of 8 is bad. And if you now consider that I sawed all the squares individually on the first one, and this is the bad board, then it follows that both boards that I'm building now must be a success. I have practically proved mathematically that I don't have to worry about the contrast between walnut and birch because it cannot be bad. Unfortunately, I only made the calculation after this video recording, so we watch me trying out which pattern looks best, completely unnecessary. If I had known before that I couldn't fail at all, then I wouldn't have had to put so much effort into the gluing. Okay, to be honest, this calculation only applies in probability. For all non-mathematicians, that means that There exists a sigma algebra and a set A in omega for which the probability of not messing up is equal to 1. Well, back to the cool stuff. In this step you can see the 8 possibilities to mess up the chessboard. For me, this is the most important step in the whole build. If I see edges in the finished product that don't come together perfectly, I get annoyed every time I play. That's why I was very fuzzy here to get everything perfectly aligned. The alignment and height is not quite so important here because the whole piece is pushed through the planar. Of course, the same must be done for the other board and the glue can be dry in the meantime. Somehow I can't get enough of the wood. Maybe I've only ever worked with garbage, but this is by far the most beautiful wood I've ever had in my hands. At this point I was very curious to see whether, and if so, to what extent the oil would emphasize the grain. Because the board is a bit too thin for my taste, I decided to glue it on a wooden base. This has not only the effect of making the board thicker, it also helps to prevent the wood from warping too much over time. The workshop where I work is in my grandparents' cellar. They live at least 30 minutes away from me, so I have to drive to them for every work sessions. Sometimes that's very annoying when it's just a matter of driving an hour to glue things for 5 minutes, especially when it's raining cats and dogs. But what would you do for a chessboard that costs $30 on the internet, is CNC milled and therefore much more accurate? And if you watched the video up to this point and recognize my willingness to fight my way through the trails and tribulations just to make the video, then I would be very happy to have your subscription. Nothing dramatic will happen in the next few seconds of the video anyway, so you will have time to subscribe on the side. I'd say you don't have to give me a like. Well, let's start harmlessly with the subscription. But if you really want to, then of course I won't stop you. And if you find something extremely shitty or have tips on how to make something better, then I would be very happy about criticism in the comments. By the way, this refers not only to the little bit of woodworking in the video, but to the whole video itself. Not only do I have no clue about how to build things out of wood, I have no idea how to record good voiceovers, I have no idea how to edit videos, I have no idea how to speak good English, and I have no idea how to record aesthetic clips. So if you have any ideas on what I could improve and how, please write me in the comments. At this point we are at the second 8 ways to mess up the chessboard. This time I glued all the stripes to the base. I had hoped to be able to save one work step. That worked so far, but it was as stressful as 3. Because the glue starts to harden after 20 minutes, all the strips have to be perfectly aligned and all the screw clamps have to be in place in that time. This is nearly impossible, but somehow it worked out. Apparently my professor was right when he said, math never lies. If you are new to this channel, then you probably haven't seen my latest videos yet. In my penultimate video I built a working electric guitar for my dad, whose old one had yellowed over the years and just didn't look nice anymore. We will also be able to install a few better components. In my last video I built an AI designed table lamp that you won't find anywhere else in the world. That was a big challenge because the AI didn't take into account how well or even whether it was possible to recreate what was shown when creating the images. If you are interested, then click in the info card in the top right corner or click on one of those both videos at the end of this video. And if you don't want to miss out any of those projects in the future, then you can subscribe to this channel. Well, I promise that's the last time I'll be annoying you with this. At this point I saw the edges for both chessboards. For me, chessboards are appealing if they have large edges on which you can place the pieces you have captured. To get them to the same thickness as the board itself, I pushed them through my planer. Somehow I wasn't paying attention and pushed a board with a nail through. Strangely enough, the planning result is surprisingly good. Now there are several ways to deal with it. The simplest way would be to glue the piece to the chessboard with the nail pointing downwards. Another possibility would be to drill out the nail and insert a plug made out of walnut or maple, or to fill it with no epoxy resin. I was actually sure that I want to drill out the nail and glue a walnut plug in and glue the board to the board with the piece facing downwards. But over time I found the nail so aesthetically pleasing that I decided to leave it as it is and glue it to the board upside up. For me, building something for the seventh or eighth time is an exceptional situation. For me, building is all about having fun and learning new things. As a rule, learning is no longer the case when you repeat something for the eighth time. At least not as much as when you build something completely new. Maybe you don't achieve the same level of perfection that way, but perhaps a broader spectrum of different skills. I also usually have more fun trying out new things. For example, I would never want to build the round AI lamp again in my life. That was probably the most time-consuming and nerve-wracking project I've ever tackled, but I'm still glad to have built it, or at least tried it. And chessboards seem to be the exception for me. I had a lot of fun building those two boards, and I also have the feeling that they are the best so far. Well, that's easy to say if you've never seen the others, but I promise they are the best. And even if the boards aren't finished yet, if you are interested in one of those boards, check out the link in the description. There you will find my Etsy shop where you can buy the boards, the AI designed lamp and much more. If you visit my shop via the link, you save 5% on every order, so make sure to check out the link. At this point I would like to ask you a question. Did you notice the video quality negatively or did you not pay attention to it at all? The reason I'm asking is this. I simply record my videos with my iPhone 13, which has a really good video quality for a mobile phone, but apart from two lenses and no zoom, it doesn't offer any options for creating interesting close-ups. To be honest, I don't know anything about cameras. I don't know what lenses are available, which are the best suited for my purpose, how susceptible they are to dust, and which camera is good for photography and which is good for videos. But I do notice a certain limitation in the variability of creating cool shots. That's why I've been wondering for some time whether there should be a next step in this respect, and if so, what it'd look like. If you have any inspiration or tips for me in this regard, please let me know. But keep in mind that, as a student, I don't have the budget for a red camera. At this point in the video we are almost finished with the boards. I always like to sand up to 120 grit and then finish the edges with the router. The reason for this is simply that the sander still has enough stock removal at 80 and 120 grit to damage edges that have already been worked on. Of course, this could also happen with a 240 grit, but you have to work hard to get large defects in the edges. In my case, I decided not to round the edges. I want my board to match the figures in order to achieve a uniform overall package. We'll get to the pieces in a moment. In this case, that means routing a bevel on all edges. When working on the edges, I noticed that one of the corners of the chessboard was not glued properly or that the sawn angle on the piece was not perfect. Small cracks are usually filled with black epoxy or other filling paste, but in this case that would look very bad because the other corners are perfect. Another option is to mix sawdust with glue and press it into the gap. To prevent the glue from sealing the surrounding wood and making it impossible for the oil to penetrate later, I sprayed the area with water beforehand. This makes it easy to wipe away the excess glue. When the glue hardens, the gap is closed and was sealed with the same color as the surrounding wood. That makes it practically invisible. However, this only works for small gaps. It is also very important that the glue dries transparent. With Titebond 1, which I use all the time in the video, the result would look very ugly because Titebond 1 dries yellowish. After the edges have been finished, I sand to my desired grit number. In my case, this is 320 grit. Then I sprayed the entire board with water. This has the effect of straightening all the fibers that would otherwise only straighten during oiling. When the board is dry, I sand over it again and get a surface that doesn't become rough even after oiling. In my past, this was often a problem. I sanded the board very smooth, but after oiling there was no sign of it. The moisture had caused the fibers to stand up and the hand-flattering feeling was gone. Okay, now that the boards are ready, let's get to work on the pieces. My taste tends to favor minimalist, modern shapes. I also don't have a lathe to make round figures. And if I wanted round figures, I would be very silly to make them myself. You can buy chess pieces on the internet for less than 10 euros. Spending several days in the workshop would not make sense at all, at least not financially. But because I don't want round pieces and there are no abstract pieces in the internet, I'll have to make some myself. At least I haven't found any figures that suit my taste. My idea is to take the simplest shape there is, a cuboid, and adapt it so that you can clearly recognize which chess piece it is just by a few edges. In principle, as minimalist as possible, but as detailed as necessary. The pieces are also a great way to use up my leftover wood. For example, I still had some corners from the edges from which I could get another one or two figures. At least for the black figures. I didn't have any leftovers lying around for the white ones, so the black figures are made from walnut and the white ones from maple. Because I didn't have any birch left for the birch board, I made its figures out of maple too. However, I think that the maple figures go very well with the maple border between the walnut edge and the squares. And I would even go so far as to say that I find the maple pieces more beautiful than having birch pieces in addition to the birch board. To make all the pieces a bit more interesting, I choose a different floor size for different pieces. The queen and the king are the widest and the pawns are the narrowest. For my last chess sets, I sawed the decorations into the pieces with a circular saw. However, this has one major disadvantage. When oiling, it is much more difficult to get into a groove whose width is no wider than 3 mm but at least as deep. This makes it very time consuming to oil the insides of these grooves properly, especially if you have 32 pieces with at least 4 such grooves each to oil. To avoid this problem this time, I milled the stiffness into the figures with a tapered milling cutter. This makes oiling much easier. At least that was what I hoped at this time. But nevertheless, it took a whole working day to oil all 64 pieces plus a few spare figures. Of course, you can't make beautiful pieces just by milling them, but these small details are more difficult to mill when the figures become more delicate. That's why I do this at the beginning. By the way, you should never mill like I did here. The milling cutter turns counterclockwise here, and with kickback this can mean that the figure is not held by the fence or flies towards me. In this case, I only mill very small grooves in the pieces, which makes it not acceptable to kickback. But in hindsight, I would definitely do it differently. We'll also see later how I mill from the other side. That's definitely better. It is also not a really good way to saw the pieces with the table saw as I did here. I always made sure to keep my fingers as far away from the saw blade as possible, but it still felt weird sometimes. Unfortunately, I don't know any other way to do those cuts. A bandsaw might be an option. I don't have a bandsaw and no experience with a bandsaw, but I can well imagine that bandsaws don't make as nice cuts as a table saw, for example. A jig for such tasks is actually always a good idea, not only because the pieces are then more repeatable, but also because jigs allow you to work more safely. That's why I always use my table sled whenever it's possible. However, my table sled does not allow cuts with an angled saw blade, which is why I had to do the cuts differently. You can also see in those clips how some wood remains under the chin of the knight. The reason for this is simply the thickness of my saw blade. This could probably also have been solved more clearly with a bandsaw without requiring a lot of rework after there. At this point I give the knight's ears by sawing the head short. The knight is the chess piece that I've changed a little every time so far. I've never been happy with the knights on any chessboards I've ever built. This is the first time I've been happy with the knights. Chess pieces are often very abstract, but the knight, as the only real piece, is often very detailed. On my board I don't want the knight to stand out in such a way, so I left it very abstract. However, this abstract design language often led to the knight not being in with the rest of the chess pieces on my previous boards. This time I have the feeling that I have finally achieved what I wanted to achieve the last few times. Compared to the other figures, you immediately recognize which one is the knight and that it's supposed to be a horse. At the same time, this shape is very minimalistic and abstract, just as I wanted it to be. I've had my saw for over 4 years now, and I've never had the saw blade changed or sharpened. I suspect that it is slowly becoming blunt and this is causing the tearing on the pieces. It's not very nice, of course, but with a bit of reworking and sanding you can't see any more of it. Perhaps I should send my saw blade in for sharpening to save myself this kind of work in the future. But to also talk about other figures, let's start with the queen. The queen has always looked the same to me. A few milled or sawn recesses on the side and a spike at the top. To find the right angle, I started very flat and then steepened the saw blade until I reached the right angle for me. Once I found the right angle, I have to saw all the other queens to size. I was a bit too greedy at this point. I just thought I could saw several queens at the same time to save myself work steps, but that paid off immediately. One of the queens was lifted by the saw blade and became wedged with the saw blade. This was not only dangerous because it could have caused a kickback, but it also destroyed not only the white one, but both of the queens. Normally I build at least one more of each piece to have a spare in such cases, but of course I had exactly none of the queens, neither for black nor for white. And because the layout of the queens is different from that of all other pieces except of the king, and I had cut the king a bit shorter, I was allowed to build the pieces again. But fortunately everything worked perfectly fine for the king. To represent a crown abstractly, you can simply saw into the edge of a piece from all four sides at an angle and get a beautiful result. By the way, the squeaking sound you hear in the background comes from the video. To be precise, from my wooden jig that I slide over the table saw. I don't know why this wood is squeaking and others not, but this time I checked that there are no nails in it at least. The other pieces are then no longer so difficult. A few cuts for the rook, a few cuts for the bishop. What was very tiring, however, was sanding the pieces. Sanding the pieces alone took me 2 full working days. The problem is not so much the outside, but the grooves, of which each figure has at least 4. Each pawn has 4, each rook has 4, each knight has 4, each bishop has 5, each king has 8, and each queen has 12. With my spare pieces, that makes a total of 299 grooves, which I have to sand in 80, 120, 180, 240 and 320 grids. That makes in total 1495 sanding operations. And because we have almost reached the end of the video, I would like to take this opportunity to thank you for watching and to point out once again that both of the chessboards are available via the link in the description on Etsy. And because I'm a bloody hypocrite and liar, I want to break my promise and remind you again to subscribe to this channel, and this time I also want to encourage you to give me a like if you liked the video. Of course, I accept criticism and suggestions for improvement, especially regarding video editing, voiceovers, English and all that stuff. And if you have watched the video up to this point, you will receive a further 5% discount on one of those chessboards with the code displayed at the end of this video.